The metal of the ladder was so cold, it felt like it was fusing to my palms, tearing away layers of skin with every desperate upward heave. My breath came in ragged, shallow stabs that burned my lungs, tasting of rust and the copper tang of blood. Below me, the darkness of the missile silo wasn't empty. It was alive. It was a wet, chattering sound, the sound of teeth clicking together in a frenzied, rhythmic hunger that resonated up the steel rungs. I didn't look down. I couldn't. If I saw those pale, milky eyes staring back at me from the abyss of the launch tube, I knew my heart would simply stop. My fingers brushed against a jagged edge of a maintenance hatch. The pain, sharp and sudden, but I welcomed it. It meant I was still alive. It meant I wasn't one of them yet. Just 3 days ago, I thought this place was salvation, a decommissioned Titan II silo, buried under 80 feet of Kansas dirt and reinforced concrete. It was supposed to be the ultimate fortress, a tomb for the old world and a cradle for the new. But as the heavy blast door hummed shut behind us, we didn't realize we hadn't locked the monsters out. We had locked ourselves in with a nightmare that was already festering in the dark. The air in the silo was thick, recycled over and over until it felt like breathing through a wet wool blanket. The emergency lights pulsed a rhythmic, sickly crimson, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the peeling lead paint of the walls. Every time the light dipped into darkness, I felt a hand, or something like a hand, brushing against my ankle. I reached the landing of level 3, my boots clattering against the steel grating with a sound like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I froze, my chest heaving, listening to the echoes die away. From somewhere deep in the ventilation ducts, there was a wet, dragging sound, slithering, like a heavy sack of meat being pulled across corrugated metal. I remembered Sarah's face when it happened. She had been the first to turn. 1 minute she was checking the Geiger counter, her hands steady, her voice a calm anchor in the rising tide of panic. The next, her eyes had rolled back, leaving only the yellowed whites, and a low, guttural growl had bubbled up from her throat, a sound no human vocal cord should be capable of producing. It wasn't just a sickness. It was a total erasure of the soul. Watching her teeth sink into Miller's neck had been the moment the world truly ended for me. The way the blood sprayed against the white console, hot and steaming in the cold air, was an image burned into my retinas. Now, I was alone in the bowels of a nuclear monument, surrounded by the ghosts of the Cold War and the very real monsters of the new one. I moved toward the command control center, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of grime and hydraulic fluid slicking the floor. The silence here was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against my eardrums. I passed the crew quarters, the doors hanging off their hinges, revealing bunks that were now nothing more than nests of blood-soaked fabric. The smell hit me then, the cloying, sweet stench of advanced rot mixed with the ozone of failing electronics. It was the smell of a graveyard that had forgotten how to stay buried. I clutched the heavy iron pipe I'd scavenged, my knuckles white, my skin slick with a cold sweat that refused to dry. I could hear the faint, distant hum of the remaining generators, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to be slowing down, failing. When the power went out completely, this silo wouldn't just be a cage, it would be a pitch-black slaughterhouse. I reached the heavy bulkhead of the control room and pressed my ear against the cold steel. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a soft, rhythmic scratching, like a fingernail tracing a map. It was coming from inside. My hand shook as I reached for the manual override lever. I didn't want to know what was on the other side, but the stairs behind me were already filled with the sound of climbing shadows. I was trapped between a horror I knew and a horror I couldn't yet see. I pulled the lever. The gears groaned, a scream of protesting metal that seemed to vibrate through my very marrow. As the door slid open an inch, a blast of frigid air hit me, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of fresh copper and something much, much older. The red light flickered once, twice, and then stayed dark. In the sudden gloom, I saw it. A silhouette standing over the flickering monitors. Its back to me, it was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated and twitching with a frantic nervous energy. It turned slowly, the neck snapping with the sound of dry kindling. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Miller. It was something that had been down here long before we arrived, something the government had tried to hide behind 3-foot-thick steel doors. Its jaw unhinged, dropping impossibly low, and a sound came out of it, not a moan, but a high-pitched electronic screech that mirrored the dying equipment around us. I realized then that the virus hadn't just changed the living, it had woken up the dead that were never meant to be disturbed. I swung the pipe, the impact vibrating through my arms as it connected with the creature's shoulder, but it didn't even flinch. It lunged its fingers like cold needles, and I felt the world tilt as we crashed into the control desk, the ancient buttons sparking and dying beneath us. This was the end. I thought I survived the fall of the cities, the burning of the suburbs, and the collapse of the government, only to die in a hole in the ground, a forgotten relic of a war that never happened. But as the creature's teeth grazed my throat, a secondary alarm began to blare. A deep, mechanical voice echoed through the silo. Strategic launch sequence initiated. The silo wasn't just a shelter, it was a weapon. And someone, or something, had just started the countdown. The screech of the creature was cut short as I slammed my elbow into its throat, the cartilage snapping with a sound like dry kindling. The mechanical voice overhead continued its rhythmic, soul-chilling chant, timing us 12 minutes to ignition. Venting sequence initiated. The creature, a twisted mass of necrotized flesh and what looked like rusted surgical implants, didn't fall. It rolled with the impact, its movements jerky and unnatural, driven by something other than mere hunger. It was as if the silo itself had birthed this thing, a byproduct of decades of isolation and the leaked chemicals that now slicked the floor in iridescent pools of poison. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the control room floor, my hands frantically searching for the pipe I'd dropped. The sparking console beneath us hissed, sending a jolt of electricity through the creature's arm. It didn't scream, it just twitched, its milky eyes fixed on mine with a vacuum-like intensity. I found the cold iron of the pipe just as the monster lunged again. This time, I didn't swing for the head. I shoved the blunt end into its open maw and pushed with every ounce of terror-fueled adrenaline I had left. We crashed into a secondary terminal, the glass of a radar screen shattering and embedding shards into the back of its neck. The creature slumped, pinned to the console by the pipe, its limbs still thrashing in a rhythmic, seizure-like pattern that matched the flashing red lights of the launch sequence. I didn't wait to see if it stayed down. I stood up, my lungs burning, the air in the silo suddenly tasting of ozone and ancient dust. The voice boomed again. Level 4 clearance required. Personnel to designated blast zones. Liquid oxygen fueling in progress. The floor beneath me began to vibrate, a deep, subsonic hum that rattled my teeth and made my vision blur. This wasn't just a glitch in the system. The silo's dead hand protocol had triggered perhaps the total collapse of the national power grid or the cessation of all encrypted government signals, had finally convinced the automated brain of this place that the world had ended in fire, and it was now duty-bound to return the favor. I looked at the monitors. Most were dead, but one flickered with a green-tinted map of the eastern seaboard. Dozens of red dots pulsed like heartbeats. Targets. If those missiles launched, it wouldn't matter that the world was already dead. It would be vaporized, and any hope of the Earth ever healing would be buried under a fresh layer of radioactive ash. I had to stop it, not because I was a hero, but because the thought of being at the epicenter of a nuclear launch while trapped in a steel tube was a brand of claustrophobia I couldn't stomach. I lunged for the main override lever, but it was locked behind a reinforced plexiglass shield. I smashed my fist against it, but the material was designed to withstand the shockwaves of a near miss. I looked around the room. The creature I'd pinned was still twitching, its fingers clawing at the broken screen, pulling wires out in a mindless tangle. One of those wires sparked against its wet skin, and for a second, the creature's body went rigid, its mouth hanging open in a silent, static-filled scream. I realized then that the high-pitched electronic screech I'd heard wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of the silo's corrupted internal network trying to communicate through the only hardware it had left, the nervous systems of the dead. The virus hadn't just reanimated them. In the presence of the silo's powerful electromagnetic fields and leaking data cores, it had turned them into organic conduits. 10 minutes to ignition, the voice droned. I needed a key, or a code, or a miracle. I remembered the body I'd passed in the decontamination hallway, a skeletal remains in a blue jumpsuit with a high-level security badge clipped to the ribcage. I turned and bolted out of the control room, my footsteps echoing down the narrow metal catwalk. Below me, the massive missile sat in its cradle, a white titan of destruction, shrouded in the freezing mist of venting gases. The heat was already beginning to rise from the lower levels as the primary ignition heaters hummed to life. The silo was becoming a furnace. I reached the hallway, the emergency lights casting long, dancing shadows against the rusted walls. There, slumped against the pressure door, was the ghost of the Cold War. I knelt beside the skeleton, my fingers trembling as I reached for the badge. As my hand closed around the plastic card, the dead man's jaw dropped open. A swarm of black, oily beetles, or what I thought were beetles, poured out of the mouth, scurrying over my hand. I stifled a scream, shaking them off, only to realize they weren't insects. They were tiny, animated fragments of lead and copper, magnetized by the silo's awakening. The dead here weren't just zombies. They were being reconstructed by the environment. I grabbed the badge and ran, the sound of the beetles clicking behind me like 1,000 ticking clocks. I took a shortcut through the ventilation maintenance shaft, the air here so thin I felt lightheaded. Every breath was a struggle against the smell of kerosene and rot. I could hear them now, the others. The silo wasn't empty. The launch sequence had woken up every corpse that had been rotting in the sublevels for decades. I could hear their moans, merging with the mechanical groans of the silo. A chorus of the damned. I reached the control room again, but the door was blocked. 3 of them, former soldiers, their uniforms tattered and skin stretched tight over bone, were huddled around the entrance. They weren't trying to get in. They were worshiping the sound. They swayed in time with the alarm, their heads cocked at impossible angles. I had the badge, but I didn't have a gun. I had a half-empty can of pressurized lubricant I'd snatched from the maintenance shaft and a lighter I'd found in the pocket of the skeleton. It was a desperate, suicidal move. I clicked the lighter, the small flame flickering in the drafty corridor. I sprayed the lubricant. A roar of orange flame erupted, a makeshift flamethrower that bathed the hallway in a hellish glow. The creatures didn't scream. They didn't have the lungs for it, but they ignited like dry parchment. They stumbled back, flailing their greasy, fuel-soaked remains, turning into pillars of fire. I sprinted through the gap, the heat singeing my eyebrows, and slammed the control room door shut behind me, sliding the heavy iron bolt just as the burning things began to pound on the other side. 7 minutes. The room was filled with smoke. I stumbled to the override console and swiped the badge. A red light turned amber. Access granted. Enter authorization code. My heart sank. I didn't have a code. I looked at the monitor, then at the creature still pinned to the desk. Its twitching had slowed, but its eyes were tracking me. It was tapping its fingers on the desk, not randomly, but in a sequence. 3 taps, a pause, 6 taps, a pause, 1 tap. It was the muscle memory of the man it used to be, a technician who had spent his life practicing the end of the world. Or maybe it was the silo itself, using the corpse to input the final commands. I watched its fingers. 3, 6, 1, 9, 0. I punched the numbers into the keypad with shaking fingers. The screen turned white. Override confirmed. Launch aborted. Purging fuel systems. For a second, the vibration stopped. The silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. I leaned against the console, my forehead resting on the cool metal, gasping for air. I had done it. I had saved a world that was already gone. But the silence didn't last. A new sound replaced the countdown, a low rhythmic thumping from beneath the floor. Not the missile, something else. The screen flickered again. Warning, containment breach in biological storage level 6. Emergency lockdown overridden by launch abort protocol. My blood ran cold. This silo hadn't just been a nuclear site. The strategic launch hadn't just been about missiles. It was a disposal system. The launch was supposed to incinerate the lower levels, to cleanse the facility of whatever had been brewing in the dark. By stopping the launch, I had unlocked the cages. The floor groaned as something massive moved in the levels below. The silo-born creature on the desk suddenly went limp. Its purpose served, or perhaps its master had moved on to something larger. I heard the sound of heavy metal tearing, the sound of the blast doors being ripped from their hinges. I realized then that the zombies I'd fought were just the scavengers, the mold growing on the surface of a much deeper horror. The government hadn't just been hiding missiles here, they'd been experimenting on the virus in a place where it could never escape, unless someone was stupid enough to abort the thermal purge. I looked at the door I'd just bolted. The wood was splintering, not from the burning corpses outside, but from something pushing them through from the other side. I looked at the primary elevator shaft. It was a death trap, but the stairs were already crawling with the resurrected dead. My only hope was the emergency egress, a narrow vertical tube designed for a single person to be blown out of the silo via a pressurized pod. It was a one-way trip to the surface, and the G-force would likely break my ribs. But it was better than whatever was wetly slapping its way up the stairs. I scrambled toward the egress hatch, my boots clattering on the steel. Behind me, the control room door exploded inward. A mass of gray, translucent flesh, bulging with black veins and multiple, mismatched limbs, squeezed through the opening. It was a colonial organism. A dozen bodies fused into one by the virus and the silo's cramped confines. It let out a sound that wasn't a screech or a moan. It was a broadcast, a burst of white noise that made my ears bleed. I dove into the egress pod, the space so tight I could barely pull my legs in. I fumbled for the launch handle, my fingers slick with blood and sweat. The creature, the amalgam, slid across the floor like an oil slick, its many hands reaching for the pod's glass. I saw a face in the mass, a woman's face, her eyes wide and conscious, trapped in the collective nightmare of the hive. She mouthed a single word, "Please." I pulled the handle. There was a violent hiss of pneumatics, and then the world vanished into a blur of gray and crushing pressure. My spine popped, and the air was sucked out of my lungs as I was shot upward through the darkness. The scream of the wind outside the pod was deafening, a sharp contrast to the tomb-like silence of the silo. I hit the surface with a bone-jarring impact that shattered the pod's landing struts. The hatch blew open, and I tumbled out into the dirt, coughing and clutching my chest. I was outside. I was alive. I looked back at the silo entrance, a nondescript concrete slab in the middle of a desolate gray field. The ground was shaking. A pillar of black smoke began to rise from the ventilation grates. The purge had failed, but the fuel leak I'd caused during the struggle was finally catching fire. A muffled explosion rocked the earth, and the silo began to collapse in on itself, the concrete buckling as the internal structure melted. I stood up, swaying on my feet, and looked at the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun a pale, sickly disk behind a veil of ash. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest ruins, with nothing but a broken pipe and a stolen security badge. But as the silo groaned its final death rattle behind me, I felt a strange sense of peace. The missiles hadn't fired. The horror below was buried under 1,000,000 tons of concrete for the first time since the outbreak began. I wasn't just surviving a day. I was standing in the wreckage of a war that had finally, mercifully ended. Then, from the trees at the edge of the field, I heard it. Not the electronic screech of the silo, but the familiar, wet moan of 100 hungry mouths. They had seen the smoke. They were coming. I gripped the pipe, my knuckles white, and started to walk. The silo was gone, but the world was still dead, and I still had a long way to go before I could join it. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and rot, and I realized that the dead hand wasn't just a computer system. It was the world itself, and it was still reaching for me. I didn't run. I couldn't. I just kept moving, one foot in front of the other, through the ash and the silence, the only living thing in a graveyard that spanned the world. The realization hit me then, cold and sharp. I hadn't survived the silo. The silo had just been the beginning of the end. As the first of the shadows broke from the tree line, I didn't feel fear. I felt a grim, terminal clarity. I was the last relic of the old world, and as long as I kept swinging, the new world would have to wait its turn. I took a breath, tasted the copper and the smoke, and waited for them to reach the light. The first zombie was a gaunt thing, wearing the tattered remains of a summer dress. It lunged with a mindless kinetic energy, its fingers clawing at the air. I stepped inside its reach, the pipe a blur of rusted iron, The impact was solid, a dull thud that echoed across the clearing. The body dropped, but 3 more were right behind it. I moved with a fluidity I didn't know I possessed, a dance of desperation learned in the dark. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, heavy exhaustion that threatened to pull me down. But I couldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's face in the silo, the one trapped in the mass of flesh. She was the world, and I was the surgeon trying to cut her out. I fought until the sun dipped below the horizon, until the only light left was the glowing embers of the silo. My arms were leaden, my breath a ragged wheeze, but the field was finally still. I sat on the edge of the collapsed concrete, the heat from the fire warming my back. I looked at my hands, covered in a mixture of oil, blood, and soot. I was still here, against the odds, against the machines, and against the dead. I pulled a crumpled map from my pocket, the one I'd taken from the control room. It showed a safe zone 300 miles to the north, a place called Echo 6. It was likely a lie, another tomb waiting to be filled. But it was a direction, and in this world, a direction was the only thing that kept you from becoming part of the landscape. I stood up, the pain in my ribs a constant throbbing reminder that I was still made of breakable things, and started to walk north. The silo was a scar on the earth, but I was a ghost, and ghosts don't stop until the haunting is done. The stars began to peek through the ash, cold and indifferent, watching as the last man on earth walked away from the end of the world. The silence of the wasteland wasn't a true silence. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against my eardrums, punctuated only by the rhythmic scrape of my boots on the cracked asphalt of Highway 83. Every step sent a jolt of lightning through my shattered ribs, a reminder that the silo hadn't let me go without a final spiteful squeeze. I walked through a world that had been bleached of color, where the sky was a bruised purple and the trees were skeletal fingers clawing at the smog. 300 miles. It sounded like an eternity, when your lungs felt like they were filled with ground glass and your only companion was the ghost of the man you used to be before the world ended. I found a rusted-out Chevy Silverado 3 days into the trek. Its tires melted into the pavement, but the cabin offered a reprieve from the biting wind that howled across the plains. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the map until the lines blurred into a map of my own veins. Echo 6. The name sounded like a funeral bell. I scavenged a half-empty bottle of stale water and a tin of peaches from the glove box, the syrup tasting like nectar and copper. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sun to bleed over the horizon, a pale, sickly yellow light that revealed the true scale of the devastation. The dead were everywhere, though out here they were different, mummified by the dry air and the lingering radiation of the silo's fallout, their skin like cured leather stretched over bird bone frames. They didn't growl, they hissed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. I met Elias on the 5th day. I was bypassing a cluster of collapsed grain silos when a rifle shot cracked the air, the bullet whining off a nearby fence post. I hit the dirt, the impact making me see stars as my ribs protested. I didn't yell. In this world, yelling was just an invitation for a dinner party where you were the main course. I rolled into a ditch, my hand white-knuckled around the grip of my sidearm, waiting. Then came the voice, not the raspy snarl of a corpse, but the weary sandpaper tone of a man who had seen too much. He called himself a scout for Echo 6. He was an older man, his beard a matted thicket of gray and grit, wearing a tactical vest that had seen better decades. He didn't kill me because he saw the silo markings on my jacket. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and hunger, not for my flesh, but for information. We traveled together for 4 days. He told me Echo 6 was real, a decommissioned underground bunker converted into a self-sustaining city by the remnants of the old government. He talked about clean water, electric lights, and walls 3 feet thick. He became my anchor. We shared stories of the before, the taste of a cold beer, the sound of a crowded stadium, the feeling of a bed that didn't smell like rot. I started to believe. I let my guard down, the first mistake you make in the apocalypse, and usually the last. The betrayal didn't happen in the dark. It happened in the harsh, unforgiving light of a midday sun as we reached the outskirts of a town called Blackwood. We were low on ammunition and even lower on hope. Elias suggested we scavenge a pharmacy he knew of, a shortcut to replenish our medical supplies before the final push north. The pharmacy was a tomb of glass and shadows. As we moved through the aisles, the smell hit me, not just the sweet rot of the dead, but the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood. I turned to warn him, but the butt of his rifle was already swinging. It caught me across the temple, sending me spiraling into a world of gray static. I woke up zip-tied to a metal shelving unit, my head throbbing in sync with my ribs. Elias wasn't alone. 3 others were there, men with hollow eyes and teeth sharpened to points. They weren't looking for supplies. They were looking for currency. In the new world, the only currency left was fresh meat and information. Elias stood over me, his face devoid of the warmth he'd faked for the last 96 hours. He held my map in one hand and my silo keycard in the other. He told me Echo 6 wasn't a refuge. It was a lockdown zone, a place where they were filtering survivors to see who was useful and who was fuel. He had been a scout. All right, a headhunter for the very place I was running toward. He explained that the silo I'd escaped was one of many, and they needed the codes I carried to unlock the redundant systems in the Echo 6 network. He didn't want my life. He wanted my access. "You're a ghost, kid," Elias whispered, leaning in close enough for me to smell the rancid grease on his breath. "And ghosts don't need keys." He signaled to the others, and they moved in with rusted knives and a hunger that made my blood run cold. They didn't see the shadow moving in the rafters, though. The dead in Blackwood weren't like the sun-dried husks on the plains. They were shriekers, mutated by the chemical spills from a nearby processing plant. They were fast, pale, and blind, navigating by the sound of a heartbeat. The first one dropped from the ceiling like a gargoyle made of wet clay, its fingers ending in jagged shards of bone. It tore through the throat of the man on my left before he could even scream. The room erupted into a symphony of gore and gunfire. In the chaos, I kicked the shelving unit with everything I had, the rusted metal groaning as it tipped. I used the jagged edge of a fallen shelf to saw through my restraints, the plastic biting into my wrists until the skin gave way. I didn't wait to see if Elias survived. I grabbed my pack and my mat from the floor, stepping over the twitching remains of the man who had promised me a home. I bolted for the back exit, the screams behind me rising into a crescendo that sounded like the earth itself was being flayed alive. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision narrowed to a pinprick. I found myself in the middle of a dense pine forest, the trees so thick they blotted out the pale sun. The temperature dropped, a sudden unnatural chill that froze the sweat on my brow. That's when I heard it, the low rhythmic hum of heavy machinery. I pushed through a thicket of thorns, oblivious to the way they shredded my clothes and skin, and came to the edge of a massive clearing. Below me, nestled in a valley that shouldn't have existed, was Echo 6. It wasn't a city, it was a fortress of steel and concrete, surrounded by 3 concentric circles of electrified fencing. Searchlights swept the perimeter, illuminating the thousands of corpses piled against the outer wire. A literal wall of the dead that served as a grisly deterrent. But it wasn't the dead that terrified me. It was the harvesters. Massive, crane-like machines were systematically picking through the piles of bodies, dropping them into giant industrial incinerators that pumped thick, black smoke into the air. This was the source of the ash. This was the safe zone. It was an industrial slaughterhouse designed to clear the continent, one survivor at a time. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone. I looked at the map in my hand, the ink smeared with my own blood. There was a secondary entrance marked, a ventilation shaft 3 miles to the east, near a reservoir. I began to move, my body operating on pure distilled spite. I wasn't going to Echo 6 to be saved. I was going there to burn it down. As I skirted the perimeter, I saw a column of survivors being led toward the main gate by men in black tactical gear, Elias's people. They weren't soldiers. They were scavengers wearing the skin of authority. I watched a woman stumble. Her child clutched to her chest, only to be prodded forward by a cattle prod. The rage that erupted inside me was cold and crystalline. I reached the reservoir as night fell, the water a black mirror, reflecting a sky filled with the embers of a dying world. The ventilation shaft was guarded by a single man, his back turned as he lit a cigarette. I didn't use a gun. I moved like a predator, the lessons of the silo etched into my muscles. I was on him before he could exhale, my hand over his mouth and my blade sliding home between his ribs. I felt his life fade, a dull shudder that left me feeling nothing but a grim satisfaction. I dragged his body into the shadows and pried the grate open. The air that rushed out was stale and smelled of ozone and bleach. I descended into the dark, the metallic echoes of the facility rising to meet me like a challenge. The interior of Echo 6 was a labyrinth of white-tiled corridors and humming servers. It was too clean, too quiet. I moved through the maintenance ducts, peering through grates into rooms that looked like laboratories. I saw things that made the zombies outside look merciful. They were experimenting, trying to find a way to weaponize the virus, to create a soldier that didn't need food or sleep, only an objective. I realized then that the safe zone was never about saving humanity. It was about refining the end of it. I found the central command hub, a glass-walled room overlooking the main processing floor. And there, standing at a console, was a figure I recognized from the files back at the silo. General Vance, the man who had signed the launch orders for the missiles that had scarred the world. He was alive, untouched by the rot, drinking a glass of wine while he watched the incinerators work below. He looked up as I stepped from the shadows, his eyes narrowing but showing no fear. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just smiled, a thin, paper-dry expression. "The silo survivor," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We've been tracking your beacon since you stepped out of the concrete. You're the missing piece, son. The silo you were in, it wasn't just a missile base. It was the primary node for the AI that controls the automated defenses of every bunker in this sector. When you used your key card, you didn't just escape. You handed us the keys to the kingdom." The betrayal hit harder than any bullet. I hadn't been running toward a sanctuary. I had been a delivery boy for the devil. Every struggle, every death I'd witnessed, every mile I'd dragged my broken body was all part of their design. The map wasn't a guide. It was a leash. Vance explained that with the silo's node active, they could now remotely activate the Clean Slate Protocol, a series of secondary tactical nukes designed to vaporize the remaining population centers, leaving the world a blank canvas for them to rebuild. I looked at the console, the red lights blinking like the eyes of a demon. I looked at my hands, the oil and blood, now a permanent part of me. I wasn't a hero. I was a ghost, and ghosts only have one purpose: to haunt the living until they join the dead. I didn't say a word. I didn't give him a monologue. I pulled the high explosive charges I'd scavenged from the guard at the reservoir and primed the timers. Vance's smile vanished. He lunged for a silent alarm, but I was faster. I tackled him, the two of us crashing through the glass wall and falling 30 feet onto the processing floor below. The impact shattered my remaining good ribs, and the world went white for a long, agonizing minute. I regained consciousness to the sound of sirens and the roar of the incinerators. Vance lay a few feet away, his legs twisted at unnatural angles, his face a mask of terror. I crawled toward the central terminal of the processing floor, my fingers trailing a path of red on the pristine white floor. The charges I'd planted in the command hub above detonated, a roar of fire and steel that rained down on us. The facility began to shudder, the structural integrity failing as the secondary explosions triggered. I reached the terminal, my vision swimming. I didn't try to stop the Clean Slate Protocol. I didn't have the codes for that. Instead, I did the only thing a ghost could do. I overloaded the cooling systems for the facility's nuclear reactor. I locked the doors, the electronic hiss of the bolts echoing through the screaming chaos. Vance was screaming now, a high, thin sound that was lost in the roar of the collapsing ceiling. I slumped against the terminal, the heat beginning to blister my skin. The searchlights outside were dying, replaced by the orange glow of a fire that would never be put out. I pulled the crumpled map from my pocket one last time and dropped it into the growing pool of my own blood. The stars would still be there, I thought, as the floor began to buckle and the air turned into a wall of flame. They would still be cold and indifferent, watching the end of the world for the second time. But this time, there would be no more safe zones, no more Echo 6, no more lies. Just the silence. I closed my eyes. As the reactor core reached critical mass, the light behind my eyelids becoming brighter than any sun. I wasn't walking north anymore. I was finally standing still. The haunting was done. The silo was a scar, the bunker was a grave, and I was the fire that finally purified the earth. In the last microsecond before the world turned to ash, I felt the pain in my ribs vanish. I wasn't made of breakable things anymore. I was the light. I was the end. And then there was only the cold, beautiful dark. No more walking. No more running. Just the peace of the void where the dead don't hiss and the living don't betray. The story of the man who survived the silo didn't end with a whimper or a walk into the sunset. It ended with a scream of defiance that echoed into the heart of the sun, leaving nothing behind but the ash and the indifferent stars. The world was quiet again, and for the first time in a long time, the silence was earned. The white wasn't just a color, it was a physical weight, a total annexation of the senses that rendered the concept of I obsolete. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, I was no longer a man named Echo 6, no longer a scavenger, no longer a survivor of the gray, rotting world above. I was a sequence of expanding energy, a roar of subatomic particles screaming out a truth that the world had forgotten, that everything, even the most wretched and decayed, could be returned to its base elements. The concrete of the silo That cold, oppressive tomb that had held my breath captive for so long didn't just break. It surrendered. I felt the rebar turn to liquid, the heavy lead shielding of the reactor core sublimating into a gas that tasted like the end of time. And in that transition, in that violent, beautiful shedding of my skin and my history, I saw them all again. They weren't the hollow-eyed things that scratched at the reinforced steel doors. They weren't the twitching, gray-skinned nightmares that had chased me through the ruins of the old world. They were the people they used to be before the hunger took the world by the throat. I saw Sarah's face, not as the blood-slicked thing I'd had to leave behind in the suburbs of Ohio, but as the woman who laughed at the way I burned the morning coffee. I saw Miller, the man who had died in the ventilation shafts of this very silo, his lungs filled with the dust of a dead civilization. But here he was, standing tall, his uniform crisp, his eyes no longer clouded by the terror of the dark. They were all there in the white, a gallery of ghosts finally set free from the heavy, dragging chains of the apocalypse. The heat was an absolute. It was the first thing in years that felt honest. The lies of the commanders, the false hope of the radio broadcasts, the bitter deception of the safe zones that turned out to be nothing more than walled-in slaughterhouses. All of it was scorched away. I realized then that I hadn't just been walking north to find a cure or a sanctuary. I had been walking toward this very moment of total transparency. The silo wasn't a weapon. It was a furnace, and I was the fuel. As the shock wave expanded, rippling through the strata of the earth, I felt the surface above us buckle. I could feel the presence of the horde. Thousands of them, a sea of mindless, pulsing rot that had gathered around the silo's mouth, drawn by the vibrations of the reactor's death throes. I felt their sudden, collective erasure. There was no pain for them, just as there was no longer any pain for me. One moment, they were driven by that singular, wretched impulse to consume, and the next, they were part of the atmosphere, a fine layer of ash that would settle over the charred landscape like a funeral shroud. It was a mercy they didn't deserve, yet it was the only thing I had left to give. I was the architect of their peace. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the silo. The silo's silence had been heavy, pressurized by the weight of the earth and the secrets of the men who built it. This new silence was light. It was the silence of a blank page. I felt my consciousness drifting, pulled apart by the centrifugal force of the explosion, scattered across the miles of wasteland like seeds of fire. I saw the ruins of the cities I had crawled through, the skeletal remains of skyscrapers that looked like the teeth of a dead god. I saw the forests where the trees had turned black, and the rivers that ran thick with the runoff of a dying species. From this height, from this state of being, the world didn't look broken. It looked waiting. The radiation would be a barrier, a glowing fence that would keep the living away from this sacred ground for 1,000 years. I had created a sanctuary of the void. No one would ever come here to lie again. No one would ever come here to betray their brother for a tin of spoiled meat or a handful of ammunition. The silo was gone, but the scar it left would be a monument to the last man who refused to be a victim of the dark. I remembered the weight of the rifle against my shoulder, the way the metal felt frozen in the winter air. I remembered the taste of the stale water and the sound of my own boots echoing in the empty corridors. All those sensations were becoming distant, like a radio signal fading into static as you drive further into the wilderness. I was losing the shape of my hands, the memory of my name. Was it Jack? Was it Elias? It didn't matter. I was Echo 6, the final frequency. I was the last note of a symphony that had been playing since the first cell divided, a symphony that had turned into a discordant scream, and finally, mercifully, into this. I felt a strange sense of gratitude toward the machine, toward the cold, unfeeling logic of the nuclear reaction. It didn't hate the world. It didn't love it. It simply obeyed the laws of physics. And in that obedience, there was a purity that humanity had lost long before the first zombie ever stood up. We had been killing each other for ideologies, for borders, for ghosts. The fire didn't care about any of that. It just wanted to expand. The darkness began to bleed in from the edges of the white, but it wasn't the darkness of the silo. It wasn't the darkness where things with wet mouths waited for you to sleep. This was the deep, velvety dark of the cosmos, the space between the stars, where nothing is hungry and nothing is afraid. I felt myself settling into it, a grain of sand falling into an infinite ocean. The fire was dying down, the energy dissipating into the crust of the earth, and as it did, the last remnants of my ego flickered like a candle in a gale. I thought of the others, the ones still out there, the ones hiding in bunkers or shivering in the ruins of cabins. I wondered if they saw the light. I wondered if they saw the pillar of fire rising from the horizon, and if, for a brief moment, they felt a tremor of hope or a chill of dread. I hoped they felt nothing. I hoped they just saw a star falling upward and went back to their fires, back to their struggle, unaware that the world had just been fundamentally altered. I had given them a second of clarity, a flash of brightness in a world of gray, and that was more than anyone had given me. The haunting was truly over now. The voices of the men I'd killed, the faces of the children I couldn't save, they were all gone, incinerated in the first millisecond of the blast. I was the only one left to remember them, and now I was forgetting too. It was a beautiful, terrifying dissolution. I was a story being unwritten, a map being folded up and tucked away into a pocket of the universe where time didn't have any teeth. The pain in my ribs, that sharp, stabbing reminder of my fragility, was a ghost of a ghost. I felt a sense of levity, a weightlessness that made me want to laugh. If only I still had a throat to catch the air. I had survived the silo. I had survived the betrayal. I had survived the end of the world. And my prize for all that survival was finally being allowed to stop. The me that remained was a thin, shimmering thing, a lingering thought in the mind of the storm. I watched the dust settle. I watched the clouds of the mushroom head disperse into the upper atmosphere, carrying the story of Echo 6 to the ends of the earth. The radioactive isotopes would fall out over the oceans, over the mountains, over the plains where the dead still roamed. A part of me would be in every breath the world took for the next 10,000 years. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a climate. I was a geological event. I was the silence that follows the thunder. And in that vastness, I found the only thing that actually mattered. I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the shoe. I was the drop. I was the floor. As the last of the light faded into the cold, beautiful dark, I felt a sense of profound completion. The story didn't need a witness. It didn't need a narrator. The earth would keep spinning, indifferent to the tiny, violent lives that had scurried across its surface. The trees would eventually grow through the cracked asphalt, their roots weaving through the skeletons of cars and the rusted remains of the old world. Life would return, in some form perhaps different, perhaps better. but it would return without the stain of the people who had broken it. I had cleared the way. I had been the fire that finally purified the ground, making room for something new to grow in the ashes of the old. The void wasn't empty, it was full of potential. It was the womb of a new era. I let go. I let go of the rifle, the silo, the zombies, and the man I had been forced to become. I let go of the anger and the grief. They were heavy things, and I was light now. I was the wind. I was the ash. I was the indifferent stars looking down on a world that was, for the first time in a very long time, truly quiet. The silence wasn't a lack of sound. It was a presence. It was the sound of a world that was no longer screaming. It was the sound of peace. And as I merged with that peace, as the last spark of Echo 6 went out, I knew that I had done the only thing left to do. I hadn't just survived the silo. I had conquered it. I had turned a weapon of mass destruction into a tool of absolute liberation. There was no more north. There was no more south. There was no more running. There was only the cold, beautiful dark, and it was the warmest thing I had ever felt. The world was quiet again, and for the first time in a long time, the silence was earned. It was a silence that would last forever, a perfect, unbroken chord that echoed through the empty chambers of the world and out into the waiting night. I was home. I was nowhere. I was everything. And then there was nothing. The story didn't end with a whimper. It didn't end with a walk into the sunset. It ended with the absolute, unshakable truth of the fire. The man who survived the silo was gone, but the fire he lit would burn in the memory of the earth until the sun itself went out. No more walking. No more running. Just the peace of the void, where the dead don't hiss and the living don't betray. The end was not a wall. It was a door, and I had finally walked through it, leaving nothing behind but the ash and the indifferent stars, a testament to a soul that refused to be consumed by anything less than the heart of the sun itself. The cycle was broken, the debt was paid, the silence was absolute, and in that final, staggering realization, I was finally, truly free. The dark was not a cage, it was a soft bed, and I was finally ready to sleep. The world would go on, or it wouldn't. It didn't matter. I had played my part. I had been the echo that became a roar, and now I was the silence that followed. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the only way it could have ever ended. The story of the man who survived the silo was finished, and the earth was clean again, waiting for the first rain to wash away the last of the ash. The sky was clear, the stars were bright, and the ghosts were finally at rest. The long walk was over. I was finally standing still, and in the stillness, I found the only version of forever that was worth having. The white, the fire, the dark, and finally, the end. No more lies, just the silence, and the silence was beautiful.